I just got a call, very important. Person on the other line said, "It's story time!" And I was like, I gotta get over here because I'm actually the host of Storytime with Uncle Scotty. I am Uncle Scotty. I gotta talk to you later. Bye. It was funny because it was a flip phone, an old-timey phone, and also a smartphone all at once. Hello, thank you for joining. I'm Uncle Scotty. We have our own mugs. You can get your own mug at Patreon if you would like. Regardless, I am so happy that you are here for the continued reading of Mr. Popper's Penguins. Glad that you've made the time to shind. Shind is sharing and sending and spending your time with me. So appreciate you shinding your time. Now, where do we even begin? The Poppers have 12 penguins living in their cellar. They've converted it into an ice castle, skating rink, winter wonderland. Penguins are just running amok, having the best time, getting fresh fish, marching around, tobogganing up and down the stairs. Jenny and Bill are bringing their friends home from school to spectate and watch all the wildness of the penguins. Mr. Popper takes all of his things down there, puts on an overcoat like he's going to visit the Antarctic, and sits down and watches his pets, the penguins, at the Popper house. And we have to see what happens because big changes have happened in the life of the Poppers. But can it last forever? Let's see. Chapter 13, Money Worries. There came a night, however, when Mrs. Popper, having put the children to bed, stopped Mr. Popper on his way to the cellar. "Papa," she said, "I must come and talk to you. Please, come and sit down." "Yes, my love," said Mr. Popper. "What's on your mind?" "Papa," said Mrs. Popper, "I'm glad to see you having such a nice vacation. And I must say that it's been easier than usual to keep the place tidy with you down in the basement all the time." It's a good one. "But, Papa, what are we to do for money?" "What is the trouble?" asked Mr. Popper. "Well, of course, the penguins have to eat, but have you any idea what the bills for all those live fish are? I'm sure I don't know how we're ever going to pay for them. And the engineer who put the basement freezing plant in keeps ringing the doorbell and asking for his money." "Is all our money gone?" asked Mr. Popper quietly. "Practically all. Of course, when it is all gone, maybe we could eat the 12 penguins for a while." Oh, no, Mama," said Mr. Popper. "You don't mean that." "Well, I don't suppose I could really enjoy eating them, especially Greta and Isabella," said Mrs. Popper. "It would break the children's hearts too," said Mr. Popper. He sat there thoughtfully for quite a while. "I have an idea, Mama," he said at last. "Maybe we could sell them to somebody, and then we would have a little money to live on," said Mrs. Popper. "No," said Mr. Popper. "I have a better idea. We will keep the penguins. Mama, you have heard of trained seals acting in theaters?" Of course I have heard of trained seals," said Mrs. Popper. "I even saw them once. They balanced balls on the ends of their noses." "Very well then," said Mr. Popper. "If there can be trained dogs and trained seals, why can't there be trained penguins?" "Perhaps you are right, Papa." "Of course I'm right, and you can help me train the penguins." The next day, they had the piano moved down to the basement at one end of the ice rink. Now, I just want to pause for a moment and say that I happened to work with someone who had a piano. And we moved this piano around. Very difficult to move a piano down steps, especially icy steps, to a basement. So, just going to say, Mrs. Popper, quite a wife. Mrs. Popper had not played the piano since she married Mr. Popper, but with a little practice, she soon began to remember some of the pieces she had forgotten. "What these penguins like to do most," said Mr. Popper, "is to drill like an army, to watch Nelson and Columbus get into a fight with each other, and to climb up steps and toboggan down. And so we will build our act around those tricks." "They don't need costumes anyway," said Mrs. Popper, looking at the little penguins. "They already have a costume." So Mrs. Popper picked out 3 different tunes to play on the basement piano, one for each of the different kinds of act. Soon the penguins knew, from hearing the music, just what they were to do. When they were supposed to parade like a bunch of soldiers, Mrs. Popper played Schubert's Military March. When Nelson and Columbus were to fight each other with their flippers, Mrs. Popper played the Merry Widow Waltz. When the penguins were supposed to climb and toboggan, Janie and Bill would drag out into the middle of the ice 2 portable stepladders and a board that Mr. Popper had used when he was decorating houses. Then Mrs. Popper would play a pretty descriptive piece called By the Brook. It was cold in the cellar, of course, so that Mrs. Popper had to learn to play the piano with her gloves on. Difficult. By the end of January, Mr. Popper was sure the penguins were ready to appear in any theater in the country. Wow! That was a short little chapter. Should we do one more? Let's do one more. That's just a baby chapter. Chapter 14. Mr. Greenbaum. "Look here," said Mr. Popper at breakfast one morning. "It says here in the Morning Chronicle that Mr. Greenbaum, the owner of the Palace Theater, is in town. He's got a string of theaters all over the country, so I guess we had better go down and see him." That evening, it was Saturday, the 29th of January. The Popper family and their 12 trained penguins, 2 of them carrying flags in their beaks, left the house to find the Palace Theater. The penguins were now so well trained that Mr. Popper decided that it was not necessary to keep them on leashes. Indeed, they walked to the bus line very nicely in the following line of march, and I'll show you. So first we have Mr. Popper, and then we have Greta and Captain Cook, and then we have Columbus and Victoria, I think. Yep. And then we have Mrs. Popper. And then we have Nelson and Jenny. And then we have Magellan and Adelina. And then there's Bill and Janie. And then the last 4 are Scott, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Louisa. And Louisa and Ferdinand have the little flags in their beaks, as they have been trained to do. The bus stopped at the corner, and before the astonished driver could protest, they had all climbed on and the bus was on its way. "Do I pay half fare for the birds, or do they go free?" asked Mr. Popper. "Janie goes half fare, but I'm 10, said Bill. "Hush," said Mrs. Popper as she and the children found their seats. The penguins followed in an orderly fashion. "Say, mister," said the driver, "where do you think you're going with that exhibit?" "Downtown," said Mr. Popper. "Here, let's call it 50 cents. I'll let it go at that." "To tell the truth, I lost count when they went past me," said the driver. "It's a trained penguin act," said Mr. Popper. "Are they really birds?" asked the driver. "Oh, yes," explained Mr. Popper. "I'm just taking them down to the palace to interview with Mr. Greenbaum, the big theater owner." "Well, if I hear any complaints, they go off at the next corner," said the driver. "Fair enough," said Mr. Popper, who wanted to ask for transfers. That's when you get off one bus and you can get on the next bus for free because it's a transfer. But decided to leave well enough alone. By the way, there's some interesting light coming in through the window. It's like maybe it's Winter Wonderland here too. The penguins were behaving very well. They were sitting quietly in a 2-seat while the other passengers looked on. "Sorry," said Mr. Popper, addressing to everyone on the bus, "but I'll have to open all these windows. These are Antarctic penguins, and they're used to having it a lot colder than this." It took Mr. Popper quite a while to open the windows, which were stuck fast. When he had succeeded, there were plenty of remarks from the other passengers. Many of them had begun to complain to the driver, who told Mr. Popper to take his birds off the bus. He had to repeat this several times. Finally, he refused to take the bus any further until Mr. Popper got off. By this time, however, the bus had gotten so far downtown that none of them had minded about getting out on the street. Only a block ahead of them shone the lights of the Palace Theater. "Hello," said the theater manager, as the Poppers and the penguins trooped past him. "Sure, Mr. Greenbaum's here in my office. You know, I've heard about these birds of yours, but I didn't really believe it. Mr. Greenbaum, meet the Poppers penguins. I'll be leaving you. I've got to go backstage." The penguins, now standing quietly and politely in 2 rows of 6 each, looked curiously at Mr. Greenbaum. Their 24 white circled eyes were very solemn. "All you people crowding around the door, go back where you belong," said Mr. Greenbaum. "This is a private conference." Then he got up to shut the door. The pauper sat down while Mr. Greenbaum walked up and down the double row of penguins, looking them over. "It looks like an act," he said. "Oh, it's an act all right," said Mr. Pauper. "It's Pauper's Performing Penguins. Alliteration. First time on any stage direct from the South Pole." He and Mrs. Pauper had thought up the name for the act. "Couldn't we call them Pauper's Pink-Toed Penguins?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. Mr. Pauper thought for a moment. "No," he said. "I'm afraid we couldn't. That sounds much too like a chorus girls or ballet dancers, and these birds are pretty serious. I don't think they'd like it." "All right," said Mr. Greenbaum. "Show me the act." "There's music to it," said Janie. "Mama plays the piano." "Is that true, madame?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. "Yes, sir," said Mrs. Pauper. "Well, there's a piano behind you," said Mr. Greenbaum. "You may begin, madame. I want to see this act. If it's any good, you people have come to the right place. I've got theaters from coast to coast. But first, let's see your penguins perform. Ready, madame?" "We'd better move the furniture first," said Bill. And we'll find out what happens next time on Storytime with Uncle Scotty. I have been your host, Uncle Scotty. We have our own mugs. Thank you for watching. Thank you for checking us out on Patreon. Thank you for subscribing and all these things. And we'll see you and find out what happens very soon. And by that I mean tomorrow. Bye.